Welcome everyone to the Interregnum final debate. Our debater should be joining us on the screen here shortly. I'm really sad that we can't all be in person for this event and see everyone all dressed up, but I'm glad that we get to maintain this tradition at least a little bit together. Before we get started, I'm going to pray over our final debate round and the end of Interregnum, so wherever you are in the world, please join me. Dear Lord, thank you for our school and all of the strange and wonderful things that we get to do together, and for all the friendships that we've made at King's. God, I pray for the final debate tonight, for our debaters, that if they're nervous or anxious in any way, that you would calm any nerves that they have, that they would articulate their ideas clearly, and that they would have a great time tonight, that they would really enjoy this. And for our judges, that you would give them wisdom and discernment to make clear decisions. Lord, I pray for our whole King's community, that Interregnum would be an event that draws us closer together rather than causing further divisions, that we would celebrate one another, celebrate each other's accomplishments. And most of all, Lord, I pray that you keep us all safe and healthy, and you bring us back together as a college again very, very soon. In Jesus' name, amen. Our judges for the final debate are Letitia McQuesta, Dr. Hidgley, President Gibson, Dean Leedy, and Bridget Rogers. So we have a fantastic panel of judges tonight. Will the debaters please state their name, house, and position respectively for the benefit of our judges?
I'm Catie Shoemaker, and I am the Prime Minister. Oh, and for SBA.
I'm Jillian Cheney, also an SBA, and I'm the second government speaker.
I'm Max Pleban for House of Reagan, and I'm Leader of Opposition.
Jackson Kane, also for the House of Reagan, Member of Opposition.
Great, thank you, debaters. Just a reminder for debaters, keep your chat open so that you can see time, same for judges. And please mute your microphone if you are not the one speaking. The motion for this debate round is, it is the year 2220, and advances in medical technology have enabled us to increase the human lifespan through an inexpensive, widely accessible, and safe genetic modification. The majority of the population undergoes this process, leading to an average life expectancy of 400 years. This House believes that Christians should not use this technology to extend their lifespans. I now welcome the Prime Minister to begin their constructive, not to exceed 7 minutes.
Lake Chautauqua was a utopian camp that was in upstate New York during the 16, 17, and 1800s. It might actually, or I think 19s as well, might still exist today. But what's really important is William James, a philosopher and pragmatist, visited this camp. He went there, and in writing his musings on what this camp was like, he talked about how perfect it was, how it was almost utopia, how it was, in fact, too tame. He said that everything was perfect. There was any level of college education you could want. There was no need to search for food because it was given to you. In fact, your favorites. He talks about how everything there was exactly what man could have wanted, but it wasn't good enough. And he talks about how it was because there was no sense of heroism. There was no sense of the everlasting powers of darkness and light. He says that there was no potentiality for death in sight, and so therefore, there wasn't a human struggle. He said it didn't feel like humanity because of this. And that's what happens when we look at societies that tend towards utopianism, that tend towards man conquering nature. We see that man, while perfect, doesn't have their end in sight. What I'm going to be doing today is taking you through 3 arguments. The first is that of the purpose of man. The second is postponing death. And the third is abolishing man. So let's get into the purpose, that of the summa bonum. And for the Christian, this is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. Jillian and I think that everything we talk about today should keep this in mind. What we should be pursuing as Christians is how we can best glorify God and serve him forever. Not how we can live a long life, not how we can conquer nature, not how we can be more powerful, not how we can be comfortable or happy, but what we should be looking towards is what are the ways that Christians particularly can glorify God and serve him forever. And we think it wouldn't be glorifying to God to unnaturally extend our life, to conquer nature in that way, to a 400-year life expectancy through genetic modification. And that's why this house believes that Christians should not use this technological advance. But let's get into this idea of postponing death. My first subpoint under this is that of the final frontier. The one thing that man really has yet to conquer is death. It's the thing that we as humans dread, and we know that it's coming at some point. We expect it, and we can't conquer it. The best that we've been able to do through history is through better hygiene, through better practices, extend our lifespan over the past centuries. But we, as Christians, know that we will never fully conquer it. It's the final frontier. My second subpoint is that of man's greatest triumph. If we were to create this genetic modification that would lead to our life being 400 years, it would be man's greatest triumph. It would be the conquering nature in a way that has never happened before. And in fact, it would redefine our suna bonum. It would redefine it towards the power of man to conquer nature. It would redefine it towards progress. It would redefine it away from the suna bonum towards us living a more comfortable existence for a longer amount of time and postponing the inevitable, which is our death. And ultimately, for the Christian, the glorification of God and enjoying him forever. So our third subpoint under postponing death is that of man's unhappy state. Man's unhappy state. Naturally, as Christians, we accept that men are born into sin, that there's no way that we can conquer that sin. And because of our sin, because of our fall, there is also death. But what we also see is that as there's more technological progress in our modern world, there is also more depression and more suicide than ever before. When we continue towards progress, when we redefine our suna bonum, man becomes unhappy. When our suna bonum turns away from glorifying God and towards making man's life as long as possible, making men as comfortable as possible, we are going to be unhappy. Yes, Jackson?
Did we redefine our summum bonum less when we lived shorter lives before now?
Great point. So as I just stated, I think a part of the reason why this is different is because it's genetic modification. It's unnatural. What we have done from shorter lifespans to longer lifespans is by using better hygiene, by having greater medical technology, we've been able to extend the life of man. That's completely different from genetic modification, and we'll look at that a little bit in my next point, which is that of abolishing man. My first subpoint under this is the conditioners. And this is an idea directly from C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. It's a really great book. If you haven't read it, definitely do. But C.S. Lewis talks about how every single time that man has some type of conquering over nature, every time that they make technological progress, it's not always bad, but there's no such thing as pure power over nature. What happens is man has the ability to have power over other men. It's the conquering of some men over others. And in the case of technological advances like this, he also points to examples of modern warfare, of contraception. He uses them to say these types of advances are actually going to be the conquering of one generation over another. And he says eventually, as every generation advances technologically, if we accept the progressivist mindset towards ultimately having man conquer nature, there's going to be one generation that become the conditioners. They are going to have more power over man than any generation before, and they're also going to have the most power over the future generations. And other generations aren't going to be able to undo what they have done, and that's going to be having redefined the suna bonum. And my second subpoint under this is that all future generations are subject to this genetic modification. All future generations are subject. This genetic modification is permanent. If you think about even our own types of genetic modification that take place, it's not like you can undo the making of an apple and a pear into whatever that weird hybrid fruit is. They stay the same. You can't turn it back into an apple or back into a pear. That's the same kind of thing that would happen with this. As technology advances, as Christians give into this life-expanding genetic modification, it wouldn't be able to be undone, and all future generations would be subject to this modification. Which leads me to my third subpoint. It's that man becomes God through scientism. We are now making ourselves in the position of God through unnaturally extending our lives past the point that they should be. We are subjecting all future generations to this modern idea of progress that is not in fact progress, because it doesn't in fact extend our suna bonum, which is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That leads me to my fourth subpoint, which is the Christian's duty. It would, if we extend our lives to this point, strip us of our richest experiences. It would take away the things that we as Christians believe are the most valuable. It would postpone people wanting to have children. It would postpone us starting our lives. It could postpone us wanting to work. It would take away the things that we believe help us glorify God and serve him forever. as Christians, we are called to be countercultural. We're not called to do what everyone else in the culture is doing, especially if that's something that's unnatural to us, especially if it's us playing God, and if it redefines our summa bonum. What we should be looking towards is a way to keep death, because that is how ultimately we keep man and we keep life.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your constructive. I now welcome the Leader of Opposition to begin their constructive, not to exceed 8 minutes.
It was not uncommon during the biblical times of Christ coming to the earth for a man to not live past the age of 40. Today, the average age that we live to is mid-80s. We don't believe that there is morally anything wrong with trying to increase age longevity whatsoever. And that's the argument that we are standing for as the opposition side. And that's why we believe that Christians should use technology to extend their lifespans. We're going to go through this in 3 main points, which will be responding to the previous case at the same time. But I'd like to just get into quickly the role of the Christian. Now, our opponents brought up this statement that our goal is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. But I want to go a little bit deeper into our role in society, because this is how we're actually going to be interacting as Christians. And might as well look at the Great Commission, which is which we are called as Christians to go out and make disciples of all nations. And this is evident in Luke, Acts, John, Mark, all different Bible verses, that the Great Commission is our role. It is our goal, and it is our call to action. So ultimately, if we have a call to action, it is our goal as Christians to fulfill it to the best of our possibilities. What we look for, and we see that technology can extend our lifespans, are more opportunities and more hope. We have more opportunities to solidify this idea, this call to action, to go out and try to make disciples of all nations, when we can, in fact, extend our lifespan. Since this is our calling to, in fact, go forward and make disciples of all nations, the more chances and more opportunities that we have with our increased lifespan ultimately helps us better affirm the idea of us being able to go out and make disciples of all nations. Not only does it increase our ability to actually make these disciples, but it gives hope at the same time. This leads us into our second main point, which is that of technology does not correlate to evil. Now, our opponents brought up the statement that ultimately man and the idea that genetic modification is what is wrong. It's not, helping personal hygiene. That's completely okay in order to extend lifespan. The genetic modification is where it comes into fault. But we actually have seen genetic modification throughout our entire livelihoods. Resveratrol is something that is very common today. It's red wine, for instance, and it's a chemical that actually increases longevity of lifespan. But whenever someone drinks wine, they actually are able to extend their life if it has this certain chemical of resveratrol in it. Now, this doesn't recode anybody's genetics, but it does modify it, and it helps repair damages, because ultimately in the genetic system, not everything is perfectly working together. So what we see is that if this is the case, if we should actually go out and stop worrying about genetic modification, we have to actually look at it's part of just human nature to be able to actually repair it, for an example, such as resveratrol. But another instance of this is CRISPR-Cas9, which is another genetic modification source that we already use. It is actually inherent in our body. CRISPR-Cas9 can actually repair certain types of DNA by using its own sort of DNA. It's a genetic modification of sorts, but it's totally inside of our own bodies. What we see is that when we're using our own bodies, is that necessarily morally or inherently wrong? If we're trying to fix ourselves, is it morally inherently wrong if it's coming from our own bodies? They're going to have to answer this question at the same time. Now, a few of responses that we're going to have to come up with today is that we shouldn't be postponing death. This is a core and central idea behind here. Well, I'd like to beg the question, at what age is it acceptable to stop postponing death? Because if we can continue to, if we should stop postponing death whatsoever, when is the acceptable age to stop that? They have to come up, is it 100 years, 120 years, 150 years? We have to have a definitive answer for this. Ultimately, what we can see is if we happen to postpone death to our best of our abilities through genetic modification and using technology to do so, we see that we can get back to that role of a Christian, which is a call to action to go out and make disciples of all nations, not at this time. What we've seen is that she next brought up the point of that man's in an unhappy state. She said that unfortunately we can have it can lead to a more unhappy state if we can't go on to continue to live. But we're not arguing for happiness. We don't think that lifespan longevity is going to make any sort of happiness whatsoever. That's not our purpose, and that's not our calling here, to be happy. Our calling is, once again, is the Great Commission. to go out and try and make disciples of all nations. So it doesn't matter we're not arguing at all whatsoever for the point that ultimately this is going to make people more happy. Being able to live longer is going to be able to make people more happy. That's not at all the case. We're simply saying that it will help us increase the number of opportunities to fulfill the Great Commission. Yes.
I want to ask you just briefly, can you explain why you've given the burden to government of choosing a number for when we stop postponing death?
Sure, absolutely. Once again, I brought up in my very introductory speech, I talked about how it was not uncommon to die in your 40s during the Christ era time period. Today, it's up to the 80s now is what the average age of death. So at what point should we stop trying to keep longevity? At what point is it saying enough is enough? Because in our side, in the opposition side, we believe we can continue to increase longevity and at the same time promote the spiritual values of the Great Commission. So at what point does the government believe we ought to stop increasing longevity and stop postponing death? I think it needs to be answered on their end. I'd like to next go into the point that they brought up about man becomes God through scientism. And they said that if we continue to progress and use our technology to progress on and have that become our God, all of a sudden we're going to believe that we ourselves are God. And yes, degrees of this are always true. But at the same time, we have to look at it as a Christian, from a Christian perspective. If we can use science and technology to actually expand and convey God's message, we ought to do so. We ought to ultimately look at how can we best fulfill the Great Commission, which gets back to my very first point of the role of a Christian. If we have the ability to ultimately make sure that we have more livelihood and a longer lifespan, that we could go out and actually fulfill this Great Commission, then ultimately what we see is that it can be used for a good cause. It can be used for a Christian cause. And it does not necessarily mean that we become a God in ourselves and that we believe that we are God whatsoever. Now, I'd like to go over a quick recap of what exactly we've stated. Ultimately, we've gone through what is the role of a Christian, and we've seen that it is to fulfill the Great Commission. Ultimately, how do we best achieve this goal? How do we best achieve going out and trying to make disciples of all nations? What we can see on the government or on the opposition side is that genetic modification, that is not inherently anything new. It's not any type of new creation. It's been around for long periods of time. Genetic modification, if we can use that to ultimately fulfill and expand our livelihood so that we could go out and actually make more disciples, fulfilling the Great Commission, obviously we have to take that choice.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for your constructive. We now turn to the member of government to offer their constructive, not to exceed 8 minutes.
The role that each team has presented as the role of the Christian in a society, and I think that we're very, very close to agreeing. What my partner presented to you before is that the purpose of man is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. What the opposition has presented is the Great Commission, to make disciples of all nations. And when we're looking at the purpose of man as the government defined it, I would include the Great Commission in the phrase glorifying God. To glorify God, of course we're going to obey His Great Commission. Of course we're going to make disciples of all nations. We're really in no disagreement there. But our main disagreement, as is stated by the resolution, is whether or not extending life to 400 years as is specified is glorifying God, is serving the Great Commission. And the government team, of course, believes that no, it is not glorifying God. So I want to go through some of the points that the opposition made and then return to my partner's arguments to prove why extending life 400 years unnaturally beyond any human spectrum is not glorifying God, and in fact, it's giving humans the role of God and taking over from Him. So first, to return to the Great Commission, the opposition presented that having a lifespan of 400 years would give us a greater chance to create disciples. Sure, that's great. We even read in the Bible, I'm not sure of the exact verse, but that God is delaying when His return is because He wants people to have as long of a chance as possible to come to Him. And that's great, but extending our life to 400 years is not exactly how He would have us go about making disciples of all nations. Because when we look at the practice itself of extending life such a drastic amount, we're not doing it specifically with the purpose of glorifying God. We're doing it with the purpose of, living longer lives, making more money, having more kids, having more partners, having the chance to go to Disney World more times, things like that. It's not a thing that has been created in order to explicitly serve God. Rather, it's been created to advance the human life and to have more enjoyment within the human life. Yes, Jackson.
So do the other countless technologies that we use day to day that were not explicitly made for God's glorification, are those all things that we should also, like, are there things in our personal lives that we all, like technologies like this that we already use, that because they weren't invented for God's glory, we can't use them?
I think that is a great argument, but unfortunately it's not the one that we're having in this debate round. I think that it's a really fun thing to consider, but the resolution, of course, does specifically state extending life to 400 years. So that's more of a personal thing. But to the second point that the opposition made, that technology doesn't equal evil, I think Catie and I would agree, and Jackson, this may speak to your question actually a little bit. We're not saying that all technology is evil. Rather, we're saying that it does create evil. And often the human intention behind it is to advance our own desires rather than to glorify God. And something that is unnaturally extending life, such as this, is something that doesn't glorify God. So therefore it is evil if we're not using it to glorify God. In speaking to kind of the harm that technology has, not at this time, I was looking at a quote from the philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard, reading for Postmodern, and something that he's talking about in the dismantling of scientism, which, as Catie mentioned, is replacing something like a Christian belief with a belief in science. He says that technology is a game that's not for the true, the just, or the beautiful, etc., but rather something that's pertaining to efficiency. So therefore, a technical move is good when it does better or extends less energy than another. So is the good that we're searching for here really that what's efficient, what's going to help us live for 400 years? No. What we're looking for is something that is the true, the just, the beautiful, the good, the actual good that God has for us, something that we can use to glorify Him. And when we're putting our trust in science that can extend our life to 400 years, that's something that we're putting our belief fully and totally in science, not in God. We're taking over that role of God for ourselves. And that's not something that we want to do. We're using technology specifically to take power out of God's own hands, deciding when we die, and putting it in our own hands, saying, sure, I'll live, instead of 80 years, I'll live to 400 years because that's something that I want to do. Briefly, I want to address the point that the opposition placed on the government of defining when we should decide to stop postponing life. Sure, people in the Old Testament lived to 40 years. People in the Old Testament also lived to 600 years. People in different countries lived to 30 years. People in the United States lived to 80 years. Their lifespans across time and across geographic location even are wildly varied. So for the opposition to say that to win this argument, we have to put a specific number on when life ends just simply isn't true. What we're arguing here is specifically the time of 400 years as was stated in the resolution. But just because we can't redefine with another number doesn't mean we lose the argument. Rather, what my partner and I are proposing is naturalism, is what God intended. Because if we're going to say that God has the power, over our bodies, over us, our lifespan was intended to be exactly as long as it is, as was true for people in the Old Testament, as is true for people in different countries. And that's fine. The problem comes when we as human beings take the power of science into our own hands to defy what God has intended for us, to choose to extend our lives such an exponential amount that it could only really be done by God or by someone who has God-like power. And On the point of, drinking a glass of red wine every night, sure, we wouldn't say that's necessarily bad, but my partner and I do believe that there's such a huge difference between extending your life 2 or 3 years because you drink a glass of red wine every night and extending your life 3 times, 4 times the amount that it's naturally intended to be. There is such a big discrepancy between that. Ultimately, we want to return to the government side's presented purpose of man, to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. And we do those things in our natural life, in the way that God has intended. But when we turn to science to take over the role of God, or even to give us a God-like power, that's when we're going against our purpose. We're no longer glorifying God, we're glorifying ourselves. And we're denying ourselves the opportunity to enjoy him forever as he would intend us to do. So that's why the government team believes that Christians should not participate in genetic modification that would extend their life to 400 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Member of Government, for your constructive. I now welcome the Member of Opposition to begin their constructive, not to exceed 8 minutes.
There are 2 main points that have to be true in order for you to believe the Gov side, that are unique to Christians and genetic modification, that are key to their 3 big points. First is you have to believe that somehow genetic modification is unnatural. We've demonstrated in part, and I will try to demonstrate in full, while there's no reason to think that genetic modification in and of itself is unnatural. That word has been said over and over again with no standard for what is natural versus what is not, with no comparison to the present, the past, the future, any of those kinds of considerations. It's all been very abstract and talking and relying on some maybe colloquial understanding of what is unnatural. I'll try and ground that for you though. And also that life somehow becomes less full, less beautiful, less good, and less true. This was more present in Catie's speech, that life becomes less full when you live for 400 years as opposed to 80 or perhaps less than that. And this relates to why Max asks, how long is appropriate for us to live? Because the Gov side says 400 years is longer than we're supposed to. We say, oh, how long is that? And they say, I don't know. Well, I'll be generous. I'll take a guess, anywhere within half a century. Anything like that, something like a standard, so we can say, why would it be up to this point and not further? Is it the present? If the present is the standard, why is this somehow better than living for 400 years? And I think something about what Catie says about life being different does ring true if we do live for 400 years, although I don't think it's necessarily worse. She says that we're going to put off having kids, put off having a job. We're going to start living later. Do we truly start living later when we just take life slower through its steps? When people presumably live for hundreds of years in the oldest times of the Bible, up to the precipice of 1,000, if you take that literally, people didn't necessarily take their lives slower by that. They started having kids around the same age that we did. They just kept doing it for hundreds of years. So the assumption, there's a lot of assumptions and divinations made by the Gov team about what exactly is it going to be like in that future. And 1, we see there's no reason to think it's going to be exactly like that. And 2, that's not a hurdle for our summum bonum that we both agree on. I think you did an excellent job of summing up how the Great Commission is included in this in the summum bonum. But what the Gov side has really failed to do is demonstrate why genetic modification to extend human life to 400 years is uniquely a hurdle to this kind of thing. They talk about how, in 3 parts, how it disrupts our purpose to glorify God and enjoy him forever. That enjoy him forever is a timeless command that the 400 years is a trifle to that. The ability to glorify God in 400 years is no different than it is in 80 and no different than it is in 40. We see this as a morally neutral technology that can be used for good and used for evil. We admit that there are a lot of people that are just going to do this just so that they can go to Disneyland over and over. There's no disagreement there. I know I would be one of those people. But as we assume motives, we can also assume some good motives. And the question is, can a Christian with good motives use this technology to extend their life to 400 years? The Gov side has talked about how they can't with bad motives, but they haven't talked about the real tough case about whether or not a Christian with good motives can use this technology, hoping to do good for the world, and yet somehow fail in the summum bonum, and this technology is somehow completely contrary to the Christian life. We don't think this is the case. We think that a well-meaning Christian who is bent on doing the right thing can do this the right way. There is a right way to live for 400 years. They need to demonstrate that you cannot. You can boil down our positive material to two things. But before I go into that, yes, Katie.
Is it your contention that Christians are somehow not living out the Great Commission, or not to its fullest extent by living lives that are anywhere from 40 to 100 years?
No, not necessarily. And I think that's central to our case in the sense that how long you live is peripheral to fulfilling the Christian life. There are people who do excellent things. Augustine did his best work before he was done with his 20s, but there are also people that are late bloomers. If I'm anything, I'll be a late bloomer. If any of us are really anything, we'll be late bloomers. And we think that expanding that amount of time gives you a greater number of opportunities to fulfill the Great Commission. But the fact that it's peripheral works for our side, because if we can prove that it's peripheral to the Christian life, and it doesn't matter one way or another, as your point of information points out, then there is no reason Christians categorically can't participate in this technology. Maybe there are some Christians who participate and some don't. Consider the monastic lifestyle. There are some people who should be monks, and there are other people who most certainly should not. We're arguing this may be something like that. The Gov side needs to demonstrate to you that this would be sinful for Christians to partake in. We think it's something more like a monastic choice. But the first category can be summed up by that more opportunities point. We want to be clear that this is not an automatic boost to morality, but it is for more chances to further the kingdom here on earth. So much of what God's plan is not purely spiritual. He cares for the body of us and the body of this world, the material nature of what's going on. And the more time that we can spend here, the more good we can do for that, which is not necessarily better than the spiritual aspects of this world, but is another good that we can do. It's a different opportunity because of that technology. We think that using and refusing this technology, a lot of this Gov case was done in the tone of, well, we shouldn't invent this at all. We live in a world in 2220 where this is invented, and Christians are posed with the question of whether or not they will use it. We think that using this technology and refusing it can both be idols. The conquest of death can totally be an idol. And as Katie pointed out, we can never truly do that. And any Christian who's duped by this technology to think so is in the wrong. But Christians can rightly participate in this technology. And refusing to use this technology has just as many pitfalls as using it. If this somehow becomes if this is a top Christian issue that people are debating on, people are going to refuse the technology and have faith in the fact that that's what's getting them to heaven. People will latch onto any aspect of Christianity and lift that up as their idol wrongly. So we think that there's danger on both sides here, using and refusing. And the second category of our positive materials to show you that genetic modification is already a thing and very natural. Genetic modification is as old as animal husbandry. When we breed animals a certain way, we are performing genetic modification. When we when we combine a horse with a donkey and make a mule, that is genetic modification. It's one method of genetic modification. This kind of genetic modification would likely fall in a different category, more along the lines of the CRISPR-Cas9 that Max talked about. What is so unnatural about using a method like that? What is unnatural about that method? And we say nothing. We interfere with the operations of our DNA to fix it, to improve it, and to change it all the time, even just for cosmetic purposes and in instances of designer babies. And God sees all of this technology in his ultimate plan. He knows that this technology is coming in 2220. There's nothing about this that's blindsiding him. This technology is part of his perfect plan, and he can work it towards his good. The Gov side needs to show that Christians cannot, in good conscience, participate in this technology, and they have not thus far. Improving DNA is no more violative of God's image and his intentions than a prosthetic limb, than penicillin, than aspirin. Changing the human body and our DNA does not violate God's purpose and his image any more than anything else, and that's why you should vote op.
Thank you, Member of Opposition, for your constructive. I now welcome the Leader of Opposition to return to the floor and to offer their rebuttal, not to exceed 6 minutes, and wherein they may offer no new constructive arguments.
In this final speech, I'm going to go over the 2 burdens of proof that the government must prove in order for them to win the round, and show that how we have adequately responded to those burdens, and as well on how they have not adequately responded to theirs. Now, the first burden of proof is what Jackson brought up, was you have to believe that genetic modification is unnatural. And then the second burden of proof is that life becomes less full when you extend your life. We're going to go over both of those different arguments right now. We're going to go ahead and start with the life becomes less full. We do not believe, and it is our contention, that life becomes less full when you extend your life for a couple reasons. First, their main gripe with this argument was that extending life could lead to unhappiness. And that's not what our goal is. We've responded and we've made the point that our goal in life is not happiness. Our goal in life is to fulfill the Great Commission, to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, as we've commonly agreed upon now. That is the goal. So happiness plays no part in whether or not extending life should be valid. Extending life should be valid if it helps us pursue pursue our purpose, which is to glorify God, fulfill the Great Commission, and enjoy Him forever. Now, the second aspect of does extending life diminish a full life, is that extending life does not lead to less of a full life. For example, it's as a person who lived to the age of 40 when they were in Christ's era and could not live past them. Was that person living a more full life than a person who's living to 80 now? No, there's no limits to how much someone can live a full life by age constriction. So ultimately what we see were people living more full lives when they were living less than, when they were living at the age of 40 and dying at the age of 40. Obviously not. People can continue to live full lives no matter what age they are. And it doesn't actually restrict or, in the end, have any reference whatsoever about how old someone is in regards to whether or not they can live a full life or not. That leads us into the second main point, which is that of genetic modification. Now, for the government's entire case to be valid, ultimately what they must prove is that genetic modification is in a sense immoral. It is not the right thing to do because ultimately we're messing with the natural nature. And we do not believe that they've adequately proven this. We'll first start over with the technological issue at this point. Obviously what we can see is that technology can always boost the role of Christians, for example. We've seen this with the radio being able to help spread the gospel to nations far and wide. We've seen this with the iPhone, which allows us to have internet clips, and YouTube, which helps us to see pastors give sermons. What we know is that technology, even though it wasn't necessarily made for a Christian principle, can in fact help Christians spread the gospel. So what Christians, we have to view this technology, view this life expansion technology, we can use this as another way to spread the gospel. But the second aspect of it, and almost the more important aspect, is that ultimately what we've seen is that they have not proven that it is a non-natural cause, genetic modification. As my partner brought up in the last speech, I mean, we engage in genetic modification all the time when we're in regards to, for example, dog breeding, for example. We do this when we try to increase, and when people drink wine, they engage in genetic modification, not at this time. What we ultimately see is that genetic modification is not necessarily a natural thing. So what our opponents brought up is the idea of naturalism. Let life almost take its course. But ultimately yes, go ahead, Catie.
Can you provide me with one example of genetic modification that is not just repairing something to its natural state, but is extending something beyond its natural state?
Well, currently what we've seen is we do not necessarily, I do not actually know if we have the specific technology yet, but at the same time, what we know is when genetic DNA weakens, repairing it would obviously give it more strength, which in turn could lead to life extension. So it's the same type of concept that we're talking about here, whether it's repairing or life extension. But at the same time, I'd like to get into what is the difference between genetics and, say, muscles. If genetic weakens, what is the problem with actually repairing that? When we have, for example, muscles weaken all the time. But we obviously are okay with repairing those muscles. They have to make a distinction between these two and show that it is in fact immoral to repair someone's genetics in order to expand their livelihood. And I do not think that they've adequately done that or not. They've provided more of a sense of we should go with the way nature naturally goes, or a naturalist approach. And I believe they brought it up in their second speech. Well, naturalists, when taken to its greatest extent, we've seen is not a good thing. This was actually practiced by many different types of religions in the polio crisis. In the polio crisis, what we saw is that when people got polio, they believed that it was God's will and that he would heal these individuals. And many of them were stuck now with limbs that did not work anymore. Is that what the naturalism that we're talking about here? If we're able to actually use technology and use medicine to prolong our well-being and our livelihood in order to fulfill the Great Commission and to fulfill our purpose, obviously we must do so. And what we've seen is that the government side has not brought up has not adequately responded to the fact that there is a moral distinction between repairing genetics and repairing any other type of part of your body. And for these reasons that they've not actually validated their two burdens, that you ought to side with op.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for your rebuttal. I now welcome the Prime Minister to close the round with their rebuttal that may not exceed 7 minutes and wherein they may offer no new constructive arguments. Please note that the entire last speech is protected time.
The disposing of death is probably the most radical way that we could dispose of life. That's what Jillian and I think. We think that when you push death back unnaturally 400 years beyond what it's supposed to be, beyond what it is intended to be, you will, in fact, dispose of life, and in doing so, dispose of man. Because without death, without the struggle between life and death, there is an abolition of man. We're going to look at this through 3 points. The first is the summa bonum. The second is genetic modification. And the third is the abolition of man. And in these, we are going to address some of the concerns that Jackson and Max brought up, particularly the burdens that they believe we did not adequately address. I'll be going back and referencing speeches that we have given that have addressed these things. First, let's get into the idea of the summa bonum. My first subpoint is the Great Commission. This is the standard that Jackson and Max say that you should uphold above what the summa bonum is, or ultimately, both sides kind of agree. We both agree that the end of man is to glorify God and serve him or be with him forever, but we disagree on how to get there. Jackson and Max have said that we should be following the Great Commission, which I think is entailed by glorifying God. How we glorify God is by telling other people about him. But they haven't shown you, one, how it's not happening now, how people aren't glorifying God, and how somehow living 400 years would take us further to that end. But they also are falling into the trap of playing God. Something that is so core to Christianity is that God does not need us to fill out the Great Commission. Rather, he uses us. He doesn't need us to live 400 years to better fill out the Great Commission, but he uses us in the lifespans that we've been given, whether it's 40 years or whether it's 400 years. Ultimately, what we haven't really talked about and what Max and Jackson haven't really engaged with is the fact that we are secondly, and this is my second subpoint under summa bonum, redefining the summa bonum. When we look towards technology as our end, when we look towards progress and power as our end, it redefines the summa bonum. It is not necessarily wrong to live 400 years, but it is necessarily wrong to redefine the summa bonum. This is something that I talked about over and over again in my first speech, and it hasn't really been addressed how we redefine it towards power, how we redefine it towards man being in control and man's conquest over nature. Anytime that we get away from the summa bonum of Christianity, Christians should be countercultural. We should avoid falling into that trap. This leads me to my second point, which is that of genetic modification. I think it's really important to look at some of the examples that Max and Jackson have brought up. And we're going to be doing that under my first subpoint, which is repair. Really importantly, all of their examples, except for one, which we'll talk about, have pointed to the repair of what sin or what the fallen world has made bad. So repairing muscles, it's not wrong at all. Repairing certain strands of DNA that have fallen away from what they naturally are intended to be, not wrong at all. Repairing through genetic modification is entirely different from extending or creating new. And that's what we're doing in this situation. Now, interestingly, I think Jackson talked about designer babies, and those are pretty much widely accepted by Christians and non-Christians as unethical for a lot of different issues. We're not debating about this in our round, but that is an example of something that creates completely new things like new eye colors, new intellect IQs in babies. And those are considered usually to be a little bit at least morally suspect, if not wrong. So, and then he talked about prosthetics, penicillin, and aspirin, as well as the CRISPR-9. All of those are repairing. They are not extending, and those are fundamental differences. This leads me to my second subpoint, which is that of the line drawing fallacy. Something that Max and Jackson have done is they have presented you with a line drawing fallacy where they've said, well, because Catie and Jillian aren't giving you an exact date where it's okay to die or where it's moral for a Christian to die, they probably don't, like 400 years is the same as whatever it was that they are saying because they don't have an exact line that they've drawn. This is actually a logical fallacy, and it says that either there's no line drawn or there's no difference between what we're saying and what they're saying. What Jillian and I are arguing, and what she brought up in her last speech, is the difference between natural and the unnatural extension of life that, as I brought up in my speech, cannot be undone. This type of genetic modification gives the conditioners, the people in society who choose to use it, the power over all future generations because it won't be undone. And that's something that hasn't really been engaged with. Now, my third and final point is that of the abolition of man. My first subpoint is technology is not evil, but I think that modern times show some of the pitfalls that we can lead with technology. It shows some of the problems that can happen when man takes over technology and when we redefine our sine bonum. Again, this is a really important point. We are redefining what the good is, glorifying God and serving him forever. Technology in our modern world has actually led to more unhappiness. As I said in my first speech and hasn't really been engaged with, there are higher rates of depression and suicide than ever before, despite us having the most technologically advanced world, despite us being able to live longer than ever before. So there are some pitfalls to technology that the Christian should account for. What we are thinking of right now is a society where everyone is going to live to be 400 years. It's not necessarily bad, but it is necessarily wrong for the Christian to engage if it redefines what we understand to be good and what we understand to be God's intended purpose, which it does. This is my second subpoint under the abolition of man, is that life starts later. And Jackson said, what's wrong with this? Necessarily, there is not anything particularly wrong with this, but it is just something that the Christian should account for in when they are taking these types of technologies into account. In our modern world, and he brought in the ancient world and said that life didn't start later then, but in our modern world, you've seen as life has advanced, so has the beginning of life. Where marriages used to happen earlier in life, now they're happening later. Where childbirth used to and starting a family used to happen earlier in life, now it's happening later. As technology has advanced, the sine bonum has become redefined. And it's not necessarily that it's wrong to start later in life, but it is that some of your richest experiences are going to happen later in life. And for the Christian, we want those rich experiences. We want life to be lived to its fullest. We want people to experience life in its totality, not just some experience of life where we're pursuing power, where we're pursuing comfort, where we're pursuing something other than the good. Now, my fourth and final subpoint is, who do you want to be in control? Ultimately, that's what this round comes down to. It's not a question of should Christians live to be 400 years or not. It's who should be in control. Should it be man and their conquest over nature? Should it be man living out their ideal of defeating their one enemy they can't, that of death? Or should it be man submitting to the will of God? Man coming under what the sine bonum is. Man living out the Great Commission in their intended time to do it and leaving the rest of their life and their eternal life in the hands of God. Jillian and I think that's what the sine bonum is, and that's what Christians should pursue.